Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion, powered by Clean Air Task Force. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the QR codes on either side of the pavilion, which will give you access to live transcription and translation if you require it. My name is David Yellen. I'm a strategic advisor here at CATF, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here for this special event on planning processes and how we achieve effective planning to create real, durable action in the energy transition. Today, we'll be having a short presentation of a new report that we are launching on principles for effective planning and fixing planning processes to ensure action. And then we'll have a moderated panel discussion moderated by my colleague Kasper Spokus, the Director of Insights for Clean Air Task Force, Chris Gregg, a Senior Research Scientist at Princeton University, Johanna Sheila, Policy Officer at EU Commission, DG Klima, and Indu Murphy, Sector Head for Climate, Environment, and Sustainability at CSTEP in India. So what are we talking about today, and why are we talking about planning? Well, over the past 28 COPs, we've heard a lot of targets made, a lot of pledges made to make real action in this energy transition, to drive emissions down and increase the deployment of the technologies that will be needed to reduce emissions. But even as that's happened, even as we've deployed more clean energy technologies, the share of energy generated by fossil sources has not gone down. It's 80% in 1995. It's still 80% today. So we need to be doing something differently. And at CATF, we decided that one of the things we needed to really fix to ensure more deeper action in the energy transition was to fix the way that we plan infrastructure deployment and the way we plan energy policy. So one, we think about this as a cycle where we set a target, we make a plan for how to achieve this in a system, and then we incentivize those actions. And then you have to go back to reevaluating your target as you make progress. So this is not a one-time action. It's great that COP is yearly, but we've really just seen more targeting and not a lot of movement towards the planning side. And what do we mean by planning? Well, we mean the myriad of processes and decisions that result in the infrastructure being constructed, where it's constructed by whom and when. And right now, we really are more seeing a piecemeal process across regions where this is not done in a coordinated way. It's not done with a systems perspective. It's not done with the best analysis and modeling that's available. And so what we see is a lot of disjointed action, not a lot of coordinated path. And so that is why at the Global Stocktake, we believe that's why we are so far off track of our climate goals and fundamentally what we need to change. And we've also described this in our report as a valley of death for policy, where we're doing a really good job of setting these targets, these ambitious targets, and we are seeing governments now increasingly incentivizing the technologies that we'll need. But we think the reason that those incentives have not always resulted in the progress that we expect is because of a lack of planning, a lack of coordination among the actors necessary, and a lack of consideration for the systems impact of those policies. So in our report and in the discussion today, these will certainly be touched on. We outline a number of principles for effective planning. And so they speak to some of the issues I was just describing. One, we need planning to be more proactive, forward-looking, and risk-aware. It has to take into consider contingency plans. Many of the energy plans we had in place a couple of years ago have been disrupted by the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, which of course was difficult to foresee, but it certainly has shown the lack of resilience in our energy policies, the fact that it pushed us so far off track. Second, we need these planning processes to be multi-jurisdictional, cross-sector, and systems perspective. Very frequently, energy planning is conducted for an infrastructure project really just focused on the intended purpose and almost with blinders on to the system's impact. But none of these projects, none of these infrastructure projects exist in a vacuum, and they have systems impacts that need to be considered that also can increase the cost of the project. So third, these really need to be co-created with all stakeholders, and we've seen movements towards this, certainly in the United States and Europe, to make sure that every stakeholder who's impacted by an infrastructure project is included in the planning processes, but that hasn't actually been codified in enough places, in enough ways, and many of these infrastructure projects, certainly in the US with renewable energy and permitting we're seeing, is that many of the actors who are not consulted up front end up opposing it later on. So more proactive consultation, more proactive inclusion may be able to avoid some of those issues and accelerate infrastructure deployment. Fourth, and I touched on this before, it needs to be based on comprehensive analysis and really based on effective models that reflect reality rather than an imagined and hopeful form of the energy system and where it's headed. And finally, we need actionable roadmaps and accountable progress tracking. And this is what many of the incentives that we've seen have lacked. They sort of put in place this push of a policy for these technologies, but don't actually have a process for how we make those projects happen. And so even though we might have these great financial incentives, we might have great policies in place, if the regulatory system and the accountability isn't there, we'll end up falling off track anyway. So finally, we look at those principles and we say, okay, well, based on those, what are the components of a viable and durable transition plan? And I'll be very brief, as we'll turn to the panel shortly. First is a stakeholder engagement roadmap, very critical, as I've mentioned. Second, proactive, forward-looking, and risk-aware analysis. Third, risk-aware implementation roadmap, so really mapping out the steps that are necessary to make sure that the incentives we're putting in place are effective in reaching the targets we've set. Fourth, progress tracking. And you know, that speaks to the cycle I mentioned earlier. We need effective progress tracking to be able to reevaluate the targets we've set, reevaluate the policies we have in place, and make sure they are having the effects intended. And finally, what another piece of this that we've looked into is we need knowledge sharing centers and reports. You know, planning is something that every region, every country, every community is engaging in right now. And they will have their own unique context, their own unique resources that dictates they have their own planning processes, but there are still best practices to be shared that can really ease the administrative burden on these communities and lower the costs of effective planning overall. So I'll just close by saying this isn't the only report we launched this year. This is our new, we launched earlier this year looking at specifically European national energy and climate plans and the gaps in those plans for achieving European climate targets, making suggestions for how we get back on track. And I will just close by saying, please check out the report, Pledges to Planning, launched on our website today, where we go much deeper on each of these principles and the steps that can be taken. But with that, I will turn it over. Oh.
You leave the 5 points up there.
Yeah, I'll go right back to them.
That's perfect.
Perfect. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Kasparis to kick off our panel discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, for setting us up for an interesting conversation, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. So I'm going to start with Chris. Chris, before you were an academic, you were a project developer. Now you are an academic who is doing decarbonization strategy in multiple parts of the world. You had Net Zero America, Net Zero Australia that have completed. I'm aware that you are starting projects in India, Brazil, in Mexico, Indonesia. So I'd like to get your perspective on where some of the strategies have fallen short, given your experience in building infrastructure, kind of on a general basis, not specific to any sort of jurisdiction.
Yeah, thanks, Kasparis. I guess to open, I might just say about my entry from 30 years in industry, developing projects in 4 continents, to academia and looking at energy transitions and the way we model. And I was distraught, right? Because there was a lack of appreciation of the scale and speed and complexity of just what is involved in this infrastructure transition. And so I made that my mission, is to dig into these models. And, when you look at the speed and scale and complexity and all of the interconnected pieces, then you look at the planning process and you realise that these models have an outsized role in informing policy and planning. Now, I want to describe how these models work. They essentially simulate an environment of investors and developers who have perfect foresight of the future, so complete confidence that there'll never be a policy movement. They have absolute transparency across sectors and up and down supply chains. They cooperate absolutely perfectly, and they execute flawlessly to materialise assets when they're needed. Now, that's just so far from the real world where, if we wanted to have a hydrogen plant operating in 2030, we need to be planning that in 2022, right? There's probably going to be a 4 to 5 year period of conception, design, permitting, financing, and then you've got to get through the finance, and then you're going to build it over another few years. I'm talking about a large-scale hydrogen project as is envisaged in most of our targets. And so we're simply not properly informed. And when I look at what you're thinking about here, I agree. We set a target and then say, go do it. And I've always been talking about the risks of what could go wrong, right? And I remember in business, we would set our strategy, set our target, and once we'd done that, our entire emphasis would not be talking about the target, but talking about risk and uncertainty and all of these moving pieces that we had to juggle to make sure we achieved that target. That's the bit that's missing. There is not a systems perspective happening. We tend to split into sectors and say, you look after that, you incentivise that. We're not thinking about the connection between them. So you want to build hydrogen, for example, you've got renewable electricity to expand. That's going to depend on transmission. You've got electrolyzers to procure. You know, there's so many moving parts and there's so much interconnection. You need that systems perspective. And typically we don't co-create with stakeholders, right? We don't do enough stakeholder engagement. You mentioned that what the IRA is forcing people to do and engage stakeholders in program design or project design. The reality is, as a developer, and knowing most of the developers in the ecosystem now, I would say they do sufficient to not be stopped. Sometimes they do get stopped, as you know well. Now, that's not going to cut it in the progress of this energy transition, right? There is the cumulative effects of all this infrastructure development over the next 30 years plus, the impact on communities, the impact on consumers. It's so complex and so disruptive. We have to do a much better job at building a durable social contract with communities. That's missing. And so, you know, to comprehensive analysis, I told you what I think most models really do. We've tried to do a bit better than that with Net Zero America. So we take the model outcomes, we downscale them to a very fine geographic resolution, temporal resolution, and cite the assets, right, essentially at a zip code level, a postcode level, depending on where you're from. And that brings out a striking array of potential bottlenecks and potential pinch points. The capital formation processes, the workforce transitions, the land use impacts and the different conflicts. You know, you have to do that level. And I would say the work we do in our net zero studies, we're just touching the surface. So I've probably said enough, but I think we've got a long way to go to bridge that gap between model world and planning, or plans or targets, and a robust planning process.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for setting that kind of foundation of how energy is built and you know, planned. Johanna, I'd like to turn it over to you for a little bit of a European context. So Europe was one of the first movers in terms of setting a target for decarbonization and one of the first movers in applying an incentive through a carbon price. Today, I think Europe, you know, has made progress, but we are seeing a slowdown in overall infrastructure development in certain areas like wind. So I'd be curious to get your perspective in terms of where the European policy space has gone right, but where the gaps are today to actually accelerate the transition in line with the targets.
Yeah, thanks very much for those questions. I think often the preconception is that Europe is legislating everything in quite a micromanagement type of way in comparison to the US. But if you look at climate planning, what's actually happened is quite the opposite, because as one of the few regions in the world, we actually rely on a very effective and very high carbon price, which is a market-based instrument. And that means, of course, not that you need no planning, but you don't need this communist-style 5-year plan. Every section of the economy, we're going to say, what is this sector going to do? So I think really the baseline of achieving the climate targets in Europe is the carbon trading system. And you mentioned that the different sectors operate in silos. So what links the sectors and how we achieve the economy-wide target in Europe, that is exactly the carbon price. And as the European Commission, we've been working hard to integrate new sectors into the emissions trading system. So just last year, we revised the ETS directive, the emissions trading system directive, to now include beyond the energy sector, the power sector, heavy industry, also include road transport and buildings. And this will really help to show where are the abatement costs the lowest, where are the lowest hanging fruits, which investments do we need to make first. And I think that will also help with avoiding political backlash, because ultimately trying to centralize a full planning process for a country as big as the US or a region as big as Europe, especially with the more politically fragmented landscape we have in Europe, that's going to be really hard. But that doesn't mean that the ETS is going to get us all the way there. I think to say that carbon pricing will fix everything is a bit delusional. It will get us a long way, but we need to look at other market failures where the carbon price is not enough. And this is then where specific, sector-specific legislation, quota systems, investment incentives or subsidies can come in. And here, the EU Commission relies on a whole suite of models, which I guess are quite similar to what you work with at Princeton, or I know the MIT also has a vast suite of energy models. So we have primes, which is more the macro, big picture, not very granular type of model that looks at CO2 emissions from energy and processes, and it's a bottom-up activity in different sectors type of model. And then we couple that with GAINS, Globium, and Capri, which are models for nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, agricultural emissions, and the LULUCF sector. And I think what you said is crucial, that you need to keep a high-level perspective. You can't plan bottom-up from a regional level or an individual industry level and then hope that it will add up. You need to think a little bit from what's the goal at the end and what are the steps towards now that we have to take. Politically, of course, that's risky, because politically, just to say we have to reach net zero and we're going to just stipulate that anything that we know has to happen will actually happen, that probably doesn't face reality. And I think here more political processes like the review of the national climate plans that's happening right now. The EU Commission will publish its review of all of the European NCPs on the 14th of December, so unfortunately I can't talk about that today yet. But this is exactly where we see where are the bottlenecks, where are the risks, and can the EU sort of nudge member states to plug those gaps that are still in the national planning?
Great. Thank you, Johanna. Indu, I'd like to turn it over to you. I think many people in the audience here and watching online might not have the same amount of knowledge, baseline knowledge about how energy planning is done in India. So I would like to ask you first to kind of maybe provide a little bit of foundational knowledge in terms of how it is done. And I'd also like for you to comment on how you see these principles applying in India.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And when it comes to planning, much of the bottlenecks, much of the challenges, much of the things that should not be done that you talked about are kind of roadblocks that happens in every country. And India is no different when you look at it from that particular perspective. When you're looking at energy, it's just one sector, but then as it's been talked about by every speaker here, it has a fine interconnection with every single thing that you do, right? So obviously, when you're planning for energy, it cannot be in silos. But unfortunately, when you do the planning, what happens right now is that you look at existing infrastructures, you look at supply. The demand, of course, becomes very, very challenging when you look at it from a developing country perspective like India. Because aspirations with development comes increasing demand. And this demand, again, there is another challenge out there because it's not static. It's a very dynamic demand, primarily because the climate is changing. And we're looking at a changing climate, which means you're looking at more cooling needs because of increasing heat in these different regions. Now, this again is not very uniform across the country. India is a huge country. So obviously, it varies from state to state and even between district, which is equivalent to a province, between provinces. So given the state that I come from, Karnataka, for instance, we have the hills, we have the plains coast, and the plateau. Now, there are various differences in there. But then energy production happens in only certain areas. Now, when you're looking at the planning process, one needs to be cognizant of changes that happen across the entire system, the distribution, the transmission network. Because If you're looking at only where you're producing it, then probably we are missing out on the larger piece of the puzzle completely. And that's where you're bound to fail. So that's the hugest challenge, I would think, when it comes to energy planning within India that is there. The other thing is also about, as rightly pointed out, being risk aware. Now, the changing climate, the heat waves, and the demands increasing is definitely one. But the other side of the story is urbanization. There are more and more buildings coming up. Now, are they going to be sprawls or are they going to be compact cities that we are looking at? Now, that would determine what your energy demand is going to be again. Now, can the planners actually be speaking to each other to start looking at these different scenarios rather than having one deterministic plan? Because you might have a well laid out plan and a roadmap to achieve something, but it could completely fall apart if you're not cognizant of these fine interconnections. So that's where the systems thinking, the systems perspective that you spoke about, David, comes extremely important. Because unless you kind of map these interconnections with all the different stakeholders, and Chris very clearly mentioned, having the stakeholders on board from various different parts, various different sectors is extremely important. Otherwise, you're going to be arguing about who gets more, who gets less at the end of the day, because there's going to be competition for energy out there. So I think that's where it's extremely important to kind of get all the stakeholders together and then map the entire system, not just linear fashion, but all the fine interconnections out there. If you do that, if you get the stakeholders into the planning process, then there is a good possibility that you're able to create those multiple future imagined scenarios. There is a risk, it could fall apart, but when you have many people thinking about it, you've hopefully captured much of it that's likely to happen. So you might not be deviating completely from the reality. You're somewhere in between, but you can make course corrections. That's a possibility. That could happen. So I guess that's what is very, very important when you're looking at it. And also, doing away with the deterministic system of modeling is very, very important. I was happy to hear that EU is looking at multiple models, which kind of say helps you to look at these various different scenarios. But the other way is also kind of one more way of doing it is having models based on systems thinking. For instance, we at CSTEP, which is a policy think tank, we have our own homegrown model called Safari, which is Sustainable Alternative Futures for India. Now, this particular model is basically the unique feature of this particular model is that we have the SDG goals. Because India is a developing country, we have the SDG goals that need to be achieved. And in the process, how do you still keep it low carbon? How do you potentially achieve net zero, if at all it's possible to do it? So these are the kind of questions that we are asking, which would help us to kind of look at all these competing demands, competing interests, and so on and so forth. I'm going to stop here for now, and maybe in the next round, I can come in with more thoughts.
I might have a question. I think the comment you made about having to course correct is really interesting because these models take us on a trajectory out to 2050, or in your case, 2070. And the reality is the foresight that's in them means we know we're going to be wrong. And we might do multiple scenarios and say, well, they all get us there and they've all got this common feature, right. But we will be wrong. And so that idea of making them adaptive, so planners should have a system of really updating every year or 2 years or 3 years and really tracking progress.
True.
And certainly I think a lot of people set the policy, it's a set and forget.
It's set in stone.
Job done, right? That's certainly the way the IRA seems to be being taken.
True. Very true.
But at the same time, whilst I fully agree with adaptivity, I think what's also crucial is planning security for investors, because without that, you won't get the money in. So I think anchoring climate targets in law is really, really powerful because it means you create an ability for anyone to sue the government for not doing their job. So I think really accountability mechanisms that don't go into micromanaging individual actions, but they make sure that the government or the planner is held accountable towards the big target is super important. And I think that we've also seen nice advances in governance structure. So for example, the UK has a committee that's not political. It's a bit like a central bank. It's independent. It doesn't tell the government what exactly they need to do, but every 5 years they're checking, are the policies in place enough to be on track? And if they're not on track, they have quite a lot of power in mandating the government to take new policy steps. So I think a fine mix between adaptivity and changing things where they don't work, but also very clear long-term plan and investment and planning security. That's quite hard to achieve and straddle the two.
True.
No, I agree. And I think the long-term target has to be set in stone. But sometimes when let's imagine you have a certain deployment rate of renewables and it's just not happening. A supply chain or a transmission log, really pushing hard on getting the transmission across, which a carbon tax doesn't do, right?
That's true. I think on infrastructure, that's exactly where carbon pricing fails, because infrastructure and very long-lived assets like steel plants or things that really are around for 60, 70 years, there at some point you just have to create a reality that will influence all of the rest, because a pipeline network or grid network, the investment is so huge and the longevity of these assets is so large, you almost have to plan it top-down.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Well, this is all very fantastic discussion, and I kind of want to actually build a little bit on a lot of the discussion here about uncertainty, scenario-based planning. Overall, if we are to go as big and as fast as the targets set out to be, there's been a lot of discussion here and in other panels about, the social license for governments to, de-risk the overall transition and to accept certain amounts of failure along the way. So Johanna, you are mentioning in the UK, there's this team that can advise the government and really push them. In the EU, do you see opportunities for these kind of mechanisms to be created or improved? As far as I understand, member states have a lot of control over their overall energy resource mix. So I'd be curious to understand what kind of leverage points exist between kind of EU and member states, or even within member states.
Yeah, I think in the EU everything is a bit more complicated because you have just 2 levels of governance, and often also the responsibilities are not entirely clear. I think climate is an example where it's working reasonably well, because we have an enshrined net zero goal, which is enshrined in EU law and has to be transposed into national laws. And we have a very clear mechanism that limits how much one country can offset the failure of another country. So yes, if, I don't know, Germany is building more renewables than Poland, that can compensate to some degree, but there's a limit to which countries can offset failures to meet their trajectory between each other. So I think that's really important, that in the end, if we want to arrive at net zero, everyone has to start doing their job. You can't compensate for one another until 2040 and then realize, oh, it's too late until 2050. I think the Parliament has been playing a really important role in holding the EU Commission responsible. And there as well, we have now an independent climate committee, which is checking a lot of the impact assessments and the important decisions of the Commission. And I think it's really good to have that third-party neutral view on the policy-making process.
Great, thank you. Indu, I'd like to turn it over to you with a pretty similar question.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned, demand can be very quite dynamic, not even understanding the uncertainties within how supply goes. So I'd be curious to get your perspective on kind of key leverage points or mechanisms in India that can also allow governments to take these steps, to be proactive, to be accepting some of the risk of the transition.
Yeah. I think to begin with, one thing that David did mention that I noted down was about knowledge sharing, right? Now, when a country does put out a plan, what's clearly missing is, as I said, India has a number of states. Now, how do you pass on that knowledge to the state level? Because it's not a very centralized planning when it comes to things like energy. So which means, there is a lot of communication that needs to happen, education, capacity building, a whole bunch of it. We could have national level models, but at the same time, I think what we need to kind of strengthen and support the work that's been set out to is to kind of get into subnational level planning. Now, that's the reality, which is exactly what needs to be done, which is where I think efforts like the one Chris is involved in and some of the efforts that we have been involved in at the national level, and there's a India Climate Energy Modeling Forum, which comes together to kind of share these, different modeling outputs. What are the assumptions? What are people doing? How do you reach to a certain point? So I think more of this is happening today, but I think a lot more needs to happen at a subnational level rather than just restricting yourselves to the national level. We at CSTEP have tried to begin those conversations in one state in southern India. So maybe because what we realized is we did some work only on the agricultural piece for the sector, and the land-water nexus that kind of creeps in the minute you get there, and of course, in turn, the energy demands, it's crazy. It's just impossible to imagine the minute you kind of switch from a national to a sub-regional level. So I think these are the main things that will need to kind of happen to get the things going in the right direction.
Great, and I'll just ask a quick follow-up. What type of local education, capacity building, expertise building, and investment do you see necessary? I mean, I understand in the US, we see it a lot that local governments are interested but sometimes lack the capacity to be involved in these types of planning. In India, is it similar? Have there been any sort of potential incentives provided to involve stakeholders?
I would think there hasn't been any concerted efforts so far within India. There are organizations and groups which try to do it in their own spaces. Because when we build our model, we reach out to stakeholders. But then that's a very small set of people who become aware of it. But there's no national or state level effort that happens. On the adaptation side, yes, there is something that happens. But when you think of mitigation, it's always seen as a national problem. And then, Government of India made some commitment somewhere. We will achieve it. How? Who is going to do what? Nobody is clear about it.
Great, thanks. Chris, I'd like to turn it back to you. So you've been involved in these efforts all over the world. In the report we talk about there are a lot of political economy barriers to improving planning processes. Anything from the simple fact that a lot of times updating planning might change the status quo and there are entrenched winners and losers in the status quo, to the simple fact that it's challenging. This is difficult work. As you mentioned, you have to go and see how top-down and bottom-up plans differ and reconcile. So I'd be curious to get your perspective as you've engaged with researchers and governments around the world. Do you see certain principles that are being more readily taken up and acted on, and vice versa, the ones that are still kind of really need more effort and education on?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kaspers. I think the efforts now are much more focused on the large future emitters, so the rapidly growing, high population developing countries. Now, to be clear, Princeton is not doing this work, right? What we do is we have a unique modelling framework that is fully open source that we take into the country. So the idea is it's led by our partners in country, which usually is anchored with one academic institution. Sometimes it might be a think tank rather than an academic institution, but usually involves a diverse group of institutions so that we expand the capacity. Our role is simply guiding, coaching, helping to resource, helping to fundraise. But what we find is, and all of our partners have been very enthusiastic about this, the stakeholder engagement at the front end, right? Firstly, data acquisition, good, robust data acquisition, can take 6 months, right? Which isn't the case when you do something in the US. Second bit is engaging with stakeholders, particularly for the scenario framing. So particularly the demand side, which Indu talked about, right? In the US, we have a pretty good trajectory on demand, pretty good foresight on that. That's not the case in most developing countries. And so really thinking hard about the uncertainties in demand and how we might frame those is a critical part. We engage industry, we engage social NGOs, environmental NGOs, ex-government typically, because government tends to politicise the transition. But even in, say, India, we'll engage with the coal industry, right? Coal industry is a critical stakeholder, and workers in the coal industry are a critical stakeholder. And we're not ideological and going and saying, you must start in 2025 and go on a linear trajectory to net zero, which we did in the US, right? Or 2070. We're actually saying, what's reasonable for when coal peaks? And what's a reasonable rate of decline? And will that make sure we don't leave those communities behind? Those are the active discussions. So we're not prescriptive. We're really trying to get bottom-up informed scenarios and then have multiple because, I don't know whether the Indian economy is going to grow at 8% per annum for the next 40 years or at 4% per annum, right? And the rate of urbanisation and all these things is so uncertain. So, deeply engaged with local stakeholders. And the idea is by the time we leave, and this was our experience in Australia, I was heavily involved at the front end of the project. By the time the end of the project ended, they was like, who was Chris Gregg? What was Princeton's role in this, And that's what we want to achieve, right? So it's not really dependent on us.
Great, fantastic. Johanna, I'd like to turn it back to you and kind of building on this theme of kind of bottom-up local communities, especially looking at member states. All the member states are starting from different points, different resource mixes, different industries. The theme of reindustrialization or maintaining competitive industries in Europe is front and center. Again, uncertainty falls into this, where a lot of, I think, industrial policy was operating within a regime prior to the war with certain assumptions about energy prices that were upended. So I'd like for you to kind of comment on that industry perspective and involving local stakeholders in the overall planning. I know it's, again, a little bit of a member state kind of focus in Europe, but I'd like to get your perspective in how you think about that even at the EU level when you are legislating or providing new mechanisms for procurement and so on.
Yes, so we have a very long-winded legislative process in the EU, which is a blessing and a curse at the same time. So the EU is structured in a very consensus-focused decision-making way. We have something called the trilogues, which is when the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council negotiate with each other. This is the normal legislative procedure. So the way things work when we're making new energy efficiency targets or new renewable targets that will be binding on member states, the Commission first puts out a proposal that's in line with the modeling, the net zero targets. It's a technocratic try at the best possible solution. And then reality hits, and the Parliament and the Council start to take that proposal away. They try to find majorities internally, and that can often take 4, 5, 6 months, where the Parliament negotiates between itself and the factions on which amendments they want to make on the Commission proposal. And then the three parties come together and try to find a compromise. And this is in many areas a consensual compromise. So if only one country is voting against it, the whole thing can be out of the window. I think this is really positive because it creates buy-in, but it's negative because it takes a long time. And what we've seen with the Ukraine crisis, with the gas price and power price crisis in the last years is that these types of regular decision-making mechanisms, they don't work and they're not fast enough. And then you get top-down emergency procedures that work, and they do create results. We, for example, had an emergency gas procurement measure where the EU started procuring LNG together to make sure that we are not being played on the international markets and we don't pay more for the gas than we have to because Germany is competing against France for something that's scarce. But these emergency measures, they don't have the same long-lasting buy-in and consensus. So I think wherever we can, it's important to go through all of the long-winded and sometimes bureaucratic process that really brings everyone along. And then Second thing, I really want to mention finance, because the fiscal space of different member states is super different. If you look at Romania versus Germany and the amount of subsidies and state aid that the governments can provide, it's vastly different. And here at the Commission, we would love to have more European funding and less member state specific funding. So two good examples are the Just Transition Fund and the Modernization Fund. The Just Transition Fund tries to make sure that we help households, poor households that struggle to cope with the carbon price, to struggle less with energy bills, heating bills, electric vehicle charging, etc. And the Modernization Fund is helping mostly member states in Eastern Europe with less fiscal space for subsidies to invest in things like district heating or energy efficiency measures. And I think we need more of that and more financing for these type of measures, because if we don't take everyone along, the political backlash will come, as it gets harder to decarbonize the hard to abate sectors.
I'd like to continue talking about this discussion now with you, Indu. Again, in the context of decarbonization for India is much different than the context within the US or Europe. You know, we talk about the funds in Europe to protect, you know, households in terms of how much they are spending on energy. What are some of the different kind of priorities in how certain aspects of energy planning are done within India in comparison to places like the US? I know there's a lot of attention also on local priorities for clean cooking and so on. So I'd like to get your perspective on how kind of, as you know, people who work globally should consider local context within the overall transition plan in the end.
Right. Absolutely. I think in the passing, Chris did mention about the social angle to the entire, when you're looking at energy planning in itself. So I guess that's at the heart of much of the planning that needs to happen in a country like India or elsewhere, because there are jobs, there are people who are dependent on these sectors. So when you're looking at transition, it's not just about energy transition. We are also looking at the social transitioning that needs to happen. And it's not job for a job. You can't just replace it, because the ones which are producing coal need not necessarily be the ones where you can have solar and wind energy. So what are we talking about? So skilling becomes very, very important. That's at the heart of the thing. But then is it really something that the people want? That becomes the next question. And secondly, people also talk about moving them to places where the jobs are. But then it's easier said than done. It's not just about the single person who's involved. You're talking about families. So it's forced migration in some way. Is it really the way to lead it? So I think that's what makes the problem all the more complex as we look at it. When we're looking at energy needs, like I said, even in the beginning, one is the lighting part of it, but then the cooking energy needs are other part of the story. So there again, how do you kind of integrate all of this? But then more important is, yes, you can have renewables, but then in the larger planning, when you're looking at it, how do you integrate it into the mainstream, right? That's again a climate sensitive sector, if I may call the renewables. So how do you ensure that there is 24/7? You can't just go completely renewable unless you have ABC. It could be storage, you could be looking at nuclear, you could be looking at hydrogen, whatever that is. But then it's also nascent. It's all evolving. We don't know. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. But then we will also be we should be looking at all these multiple levers, rather than saying, okay, deterministically, okay, if I do this, this is where I get. Okay, if I do 10% of this, 20% of this, 50% of this, or whatever that is, keep changing those probabilities and then try and see what works best. It should be a basket of solutions rather than one single solution that should be determining where you go with respect to energy planning.
Yeah, maybe one very short reaction to that really resonates with me. And I think what a categorization that also helps is no regret options versus regret options. Because
Absolutely.
for no regret options, you don't need to care so much about the politics or the social aspects of it. What I classify as no regret options are options that are really good for everyone. And they are economic, they make social sense, they make sense from a systems perspective. Then for the regret options, in a way, this is where you really need to structure a good stakeholder engagement process and a good political process, because otherwise it will go out of the window 5 years later. So to make a concrete example, it's again, it's not India specific, it's Europe specific, but we're talking about hydrogen a lot. And there are some clusters where there's just a lot of industrial off-takers. So the corridor between the port of Rotterdam and the Ruhr area in Germany, which is highly industrialized, and then the chemical sector in Belgium and Luxembourg, that will be a future off-taker no matter which scenario you look at. So building a pipeline down that corridor, that might be expensive, but it's a 300-kilometer pipeline, it makes total sense. Whereas building a pipeline from Austria to Greece, there's also ports in Greece, hydrogen could be landing there, but it's a high-risk, high-cost type of option. So I think also putting that lens of regret, no regret over these type of decisions can help as well.
I wouldn't mind just talking about hydrogen for a minute, because in my former career I was involved in the second hydrogen boom, not the first one back in the 80s, but the second one. And it didn't get off the ground, and so I'm interested in, Europe has a 10 million tonne per annum renewable hydrogen target for 2030. And so on this subject of proactive, robust planning processes, my assessment is you'll miss it by a factor of 5. And I think the US will probably miss theirs by a factor, similar 10 million tonne, by a factor of 3 to 5. I tend to be a bit of a pessimist, I'm sorry, but in a part, that's the target setting, 10 million tonnes a year. Incentive setting, CFDs, or in our case, IRA, but actually the planning for that is less than adequate.
I agree. I have got to be a bit careful here. I mean, these are targets. The 10 million tons are an aspirational target that was set in the Repower EU communication, which is a communication. It's not a directive. It's not a law yet. I think the 2040 modeling will show us with much more specificity what's realistic to achieve. That should come out at the start of next year. But I agree, especially the infrastructure planning is definitely not adequate for these levels of domestic production, and maybe even the spatial planning is difficult, the land availability for the renewables, etc. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. On this
India has a big aspiration for hydrogen too, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has a big aspiration for hydrogen. No one has a robust plan for it.
Well, so I'd like to... Oh, go for it.
Yeah, maybe one quick reaction. I think one positive thing on the way to these 10 million tons is that we have started an EU-wide auction for renewable hydrogen production. So we started a market-based process that will make project developers compete against each other in an auction of who needs the lowest subsidy to produce renewable hydrogen. And beyond distributing the subsidy in an efficient way, which is nice, what this also does, it creates a lot of data and price points. So we hope that we really get hundreds of bids of where project developers want to develop and where the industrial offtake is. And the data is super valuable for doing infrastructure planning. So any mechanism that's a quota or subsidy or something like that also always has the secondary effect of creating data, and then hopefully the infrastructure planning can flow from that a little bit better.
So, Chris, you mentioned, you don't expect these targets to be hit. Has the modeling community maybe inadvertently misled policymakers in terms of what is possible through their modeling by not accounting for these? And then do you see ways by which this could be rectified to kind of provide actual reasonable pathways, and so that targets are not set before the comprehensive analysis is done?
Yeah, with due respect to my modelling colleagues, I think the answer is yes, right? That they are indeed have misled policymakers. And you only have to look at the IRA, right? Where all the modelling community now is running around saying, how come these assets aren't materialising in response to the IRA? The reality is with a hydrogen project, it is, like I talked about in the opening, right? It's a 8 to 10 year lead time from conception through to building. So if these projects aren't already sanctioned, very few of them are going to be operating in 2030. And so certainly I think the modelling community is now very open-minded. 10 years ago, blank stares when you talked about bottlenecks and deployment challenges. They're very open-minded now, so we're starting to think about lumpy investments sequencing, so recognising that transmission infrastructure doesn't just incrementally expand in time wherever you want it. It's a big lump of investment that has to be planned well in advance of when renewables are requiring it. And then also thinking about, you talked about bottlenecks that emerge in time. It is inevitable because we don't have perfect foresight and we can't coordinate supply chains and labour force requirements. We actually have to expect these bottlenecks. And so coming up with mathematical representations that could simulate these onsets of bottlenecks is going to make models not more right, but certainly more robust. And I think there's an openness. I don't know whether you can do it at the global IAM scale. Certainly at national scales and at state scales and subnational scales, you should be able to do that quite effectively.
Great. Any follow-up? No? Okay. Okay. Well, we are slowly kind of running out of time. So I'd like to try to end on a positive note here. So I'd like to ask each of you to share where you're seeing progress in effective planning in whichever jurisdiction you would like to discuss, but also highlight one or two key things that we as policymakers, NGOs, people who work in government should focus on in the next year or so to try to increase the robustness of how we're approaching the overall strategy to decarbonize. So perhaps, Johanna, I'll give you the first go, and then we can come back.
Yeah, happy to. So what makes me really hopeful is that we're moving from setting a global galactic climate target for 2050 towards really going niche on the legislation of what this means in each individual area. And I think the Fit for 55 package, which is the big legislative package that we're almost done pushing through the trilogue process in Europe right now, that's a great example for that. It is overkill for everyone. It's overkill for the policymakers. It's dozens of laws. It's overkill for the NGOs, for the people who try to quantify the effects of it. It will be overkill for the member states who have to implement it into national law. But it moves that one step further from we're going to be net zero by 2050 to this is what this means for renewable builds out. This is what it means for permitting. This is what it means for interconnection and grid build out for every area from household level to heavy industry. And I think the next 5 years will show how well we implement Fit for 55. So that makes me hopeful because we moved one step further towards concrete, specific, what has to happen in each individual area. And I hope we can sustain political momentum to push this over the finish line.
I'm probably going to zero in on Australia, which historically has had a dreadful record in terms of climate policy. But in fact, we recently finished that Net Zero Australia project, and what we find, because it's a vast country with relatively low population density in certain parts where the renewables are rich, some of the states have now gone and proactively set about permitting very large tracts of renewable energy zones and starting to develop negotiated right-of-ways with communities to get those to the demand centres. Now, it's not big enough in terms of scale, right? So I think they need to amplify their expectations on scale, but it is a signal of proactive planning, right? Putting in place this for what is going to happen 10 years from now that I think we need to see a lot more of. And similar sorts of things with hydrogen. So that's a positive.
Yes, I think from an India perspective, what I see as hopeful is that modelers are speaking to each other. But I think we really have to open up the models. When I say open the models, talk about the assumptions that go in, and then question each other's assumptions. I think that's what needs to be very clear, and it's beginning to happen, which is why I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come up with probably quite realistic kind of assumptions that go into building these models, which would aid in planning. And also the policymakers are kind of opening up to listening to what people have to say. So they're kind of inviting the consortia and then talking to us and saying, okay, this is what we are looking for. What do your models say? Can you give us some options? So they're thinking about options now rather than saying, okay, this is what we want, this is what we're going to do. So which is what gives me hope.
I want to ask one last comment of you both. Is any government giving thought, serious thought, to what if we don't achieve these targets?
What if we change
What if we
these
don't?
targets?
No. What if we don't achieve them?
Achieve.
Right. So, from a climate perspective, what's our plan?
I'm Shubhendu. I lead energy strategy team of Ministry of Energy and United Arab Emirates. So we designed and implemented and now rolling out energy strategy. So I'm a practitioner in this. I'm heading this energy transition and net zero team for UAE. Also, I'm in the World Bank because I moved from World Bank here. I supported India government and Southeast Asian countries, and before that as a partner in Ernst & Young supported many of the countries. First one, and the other thing on the India, your question is that not achieving net zero, that's not an option anymore. Because, no, I'm coming to this. For here, if I give you the numbers, don't quote, unofficial, right? If I go for the gas way, normal way, the energy cost by 2030, 2040, 2050 will be double that of if I go the renewable plus storage cost. I cannot even 0.1 cents because it directly cost my inflation, because like these countries we are going out of oil and non-oil trades business. So my sensitivity of the economic towards the energy price is very, very high. By any means, I cannot get a coal less than 12 to 14 cents now. By any means, I cannot get solar more than maybe 1.5 cents or 2 cents. The difference is so high, even including storage. The CATL CEO was in our office. They are offering $160 per kWh with the 12,000 cycles. Means I am talking about the fixed cost of the storage is coming less than 1.6 cents. With renewable, with another 2 cents, it's a 50% difference. The sensitivity to the price is so high, we cannot go back. It is already gone a one-way direction. So the first question of this. Second, on the other side, on the India, because I think the way they have driven towards the chaos of the disorder is fantastic. I think that model, because of the bank and others, I go up multiple countries, what they did, fantastic. In 2014-15, they did renewable energy integration study, and I was leading that. We developed the renewable energy management centers over here. Now, that's a center-wide planning. Otherwise, from 2008, the first 500 megawatt tender, we cannot come to 100 gigawatt plus solar by 2022. And it is going to be 300. The first infrastructure, how, and the rules and regulations, how to be laid out, I think that's a very, very fantastically planned. We took a cue from Germany, basically, at that time with Fraunhofer help. But the way we developed our rules and regulations, because I remember the first regulations I written for forecasting deviation settlement 2015, 13th of August. Ancillary services in 27th of August, this first one got out. And then India did a fantastic one in terms of transmission. Instead of today, any point of India from any point to other point, transmission, there is no bottleneck. There is a high, 1000 kV, 1200 kV, HVDC lines are getting it. I think 12 of them getting constructed as we go more and more. Now, the point is, any point of time you can support more than 4,000 megawatt, any 24 hours. No other country has this congestion issues over. Now, what it gives a uniform single price across the country. The moment you have a uniform single market price, then any of the states which is inefficient, they cannot, because then they can get the power back. So they opened up the market, opened up the generation sector and transmission sector, and part of distribution is getting opened. So that gives a competition, and because your road is empty, the efficiency is coming down. So on the planning side, I'll say CEA is doing fantastic. They already give a 2030 perspective plan, and we know how much coal is going to come out exactly. If you tell me, I can tell you, and how much coal is going to go off.
So will you hit 5,000 gigawatts by 2070?
2070, I think we'll be out of coal before that.
No, but will you build 5,000 gigawatts of solar by 2050, 2070? You're going to need.
I don't think we need that amount. I'll tell you the other number. In 1984, India's fertility was, no, it will not get it. I'll give you the reason, because I do that demand planning.
Okay, but please, we are already way over time, so please keep it to 30 seconds.
Yeah, 1980, India's women fertility was 5.84. Today, out of 30 states, 21 states is below 1.9. The change is happening, and the per capita consumption is happening, the age profile is happening. I don't think even that we'll reach that amount of demand requirement over there, and with the efficiency is building in. So we can discuss on that. I have the numbers, and you can imagine I have all the numbers with me.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if you have a little bit of time to answer kind of maybe the near-term perspective, if you're not going to be hitting 2027 or 2030 targets, not talking about 2070, if they're just due to various types of delays, or not even delays, but the lack of having some of these infrastructure planning cycles built into the targets, what's the response? Yeah, what's the contingency plan? And do you see that, if you see that on your way to the target, how do people respond? And you don't have to suggest anything, but curious to get everyone's thoughts on that. Is that the right framing? Okay.
Maybe in terms of the long-term targets, I think that it's not a black and white, we're missing 2050 or we are achieving 2050. We're going to do better or do worse. And I think the ambition's always got to be we do as well as we can, because it's not like the world goes under if we hit over and everything's going to be fine if we're just underneath. So I think the ambition's always got to be let's get as close to it as possible or exceed as much as possible. But it's not a binary threshold. I'm going to keep it with that.
Great. Indu, any comments? Or should we?
Not really.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. And we look forward to discussing this more over the years. Please check out our new report, Pledges to Plans, that are online, that provide principles for effective planning and components of effective energy plans. And we'll be around after the event if you have any questions. Thank you for coming.